This morning, we're starting a new segment called Bridging the Divide. The goal is to encourage all of us to try to have actual conversations with people we don't agree with. It's not something we do very often, especially face-to-face. Our mission is to bring people who disagree on controversial topics together in the same room to have a conversation. The hope is that they can get a better appreciation for the other person's point of view, or even find some things that they agree on. But today, for our first segment, we want to start with two people who can serve as a great example for the rest of us, despite being on two very different sides of the debate over race and policing in America. They managed to not only find common ground, but respect for each other in the process. On one side is Andre Taylor, whose brother, Shay Taylor, was shot and killed by Seattle police.
Hands up, right now! Hands up!
On the other side is Dave Hayes, a Republican state lawmaker who works as a police officer in Snohomish County.
When we're considering these policies, we must consider the people that it's going to affect.
The two men disagree on a lot in the debate over race and policing, which is why this next part may seem unusual.
I'm grateful to be here with you, Rep. Hayes.
Yeah,
I mean that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Since his brother's death in 2016, Andre Taylor had fought to change a state law that made it nearly impossible to prosecute police officers who use deadly force.
Even if you comply, you die.
He found an unlikely ally in Dave Hayes.
I believe that he made a conscious decision about something that has the ability to further our community, our state, and our country. And anybody that takes a stand like that, I'm a fan of.
What do you think hearing that?
Well, it's very flattering. Thank you for saying that. While I am a law enforcement officer, and many people might look at me and say, well, Dave Hayes is going to be there to be an advocate for law enforcement. I take my responsibilities as a state representative very seriously.
It was with that in mind that Representative Hayes, along with Democrat Roger Goodman, came together to find a compromise to the state's deadly force law. A compromise Andre Taylor never expected to come, given how divisive of an issue it is.
Because there was an apprehension from community and law enforcement to engage. I think law enforcement felt that they could not engage with the community because there are some community folks that maybe they felt were anti-police. And then we felt some way about police officers that, they don't care about the community, right?
To say that there was some difficulties bringing all the parties together, I think that would be a true statement.
Of course, Representative Hayes did have his motivations for coming to the table. Andre Taylor's side had gathered enough signatures to put their version of a new deadly force law on the ballot. Hayes and others felt they either had to find a compromise or risk having voters pass a bill that was unfair to police officers. And that meant starting a dialogue, a real dialogue, where both sides were willing to listen.
It gave us an opportunity to come together and to find out, wow, these people are not against the community, and law enforcement were like, well, they're not against cops.
The compromise bill that ultimately passed in Olympia earlier this year changes the standard for prosecuting police. Instead of having to prove an officer killed someone with malice, prosecutors must now prove only that the officer didn't do what a reasonable officer would have done in the same situation. Have you since then gotten any sort of negative feedback from the law enforcement community about the compromise that you reached?
There were some questions. There were certainly questions about why we compromised, and questions about the exact policy. Officers across the nation, to some degree or another, feel like they're under attack. So it's always going to be the reaction for a law enforcement officer to be very defensive about that when we are talking about our livelihood.
And by coming to the table, Representative Hayes made sure the voices of police officers were heard. And in the process, both sides found a better understanding of where each other were coming from.
I remember listening to one of the members of the task force talk about what happens when two African American men come together and what happens when they part. And what they say to each other when they part. I, as a law enforcement officer, say the exact same thing to a fellow law enforcement officer, and that's the term, be safe.
Because you are aware of the possibility of danger happening at any time as a law enforcement officer. So it is with a young black male.
It's interesting the things you can learn about someone else's perspective if you take the time to listen. And in this case, two men with very different perspectives found compromise on one of the most divisive issues in America: race and policing.
That's one of my missions as a lawmaker. One of my missions as a statesman and a public servant is to not focus on division.
This is why I said that I'm a fan of Rep. Hayes, because of his leadership. It's not easy to lead. It's difficult. We've come together, we work together, and bam, here we are. That's the biggest takeaway for me.
Bridging the Divide will air every Friday morning at this same time. Next week, we're bringing together two people who disagree on one major aspect of the gun control debate: how old you should be to own a firearm. Until then, I'm assigning you a little homework. I want you to try having a conversation with someone you disagree with, a real conversation where you also take the time to listen. You might be surprised by how much you